Let's talk about how to include your CSS within your HTML so it affects your web page. There's a few ways to do this. The one that is used professionally is to include all your CSS in a separate file and to put a link to that file within the head element of your HTML. We do this with the link element, and there's a few attributes that you need to remember. The first is the rel attribute. This defines the relationship to the HTML, and in this case, the link is a style sheet. The second is the file type, which in this case is a CSS file. So we have text CSS in here. The third and most important is the href attribute. This is a link to your CSS file. My HTML file and my CSS file are in the same place, so I can just write the name of the CSS file here. Remember that if it's included in a folder, that you'd have to write the folder name as well. I've already created my style.css file. So if I write some CSS in it, now that it's linked to the HTML file, it will affect the HTML elements. This is the preferred way to do it, as it keeps the CSS separate, so it's easier to manage and it means that we can share the CSS between HTML pages. This is the way that we'll be writing CSS for the rest of the course. However, there are a couple more ways. We can include CSS directly in the head of our HTML file. We do this within style tags. And inside those style tags, we write CSS directly. This is pretty fast as it loads with the HTML page. However, it only works on the HTML page it's written on, which means when you are working with CSS for the whole website, it's not a great option as so much is shared. The third way, which is reserved for special situations, is the style attribute, which you add specifically to an element. So we don't write a whole block of text. We just write our property value pairs within the attribute. As is added directly to our element, it just affects that one element and nothing else on the page. It also holds a lot of weight, even more than an ID. If you remember from our last video, this way of adding CSS means that it's very specific. For those reasons, we reserve it for interactive CSS changes, like those we would make with JavaScript. Let's take a look at DevTools again. If we look at this header and the styles being affected to it in the styles pane, I haven't written any more CSS than you've seen me write, but there's all this other CSS being applied. For instance, this header display block. If we look next to the style, it tells us where that CSS is written. So for this instance, it says element.style, and because there's no file, there's nothing up here on the right. If I look at the article, we have the background color with style.css. So it shows us the file that it's written in. However, it says that these extra styles that we haven't written are from the user agent style sheet. That's not something that we've done. If you see this, it means that the CSS is being applied by the browser itself. Remember when we were writing all our HTML in the last part, that our headings were different sizes and we hadn't written any CSS yet. That's because the browser has default styles for all HTML elements. Before we start writing CSS of our own, we should either remove the styling or look at ways to make sure all browsers have the same, as they all contain their own unique styling. Luckily for us, some clever people before us have already thought of this. There's a solution for each situation. You just have to choose the one that you want. To remove the styles so you can start afresh, there's Reset CSS by Eric Mayer. It's some CSS you can either copy or include into a file at the top of your CSS, which removes the majority of browser styles. This is really good when you're learning, because the browser styles won't affect the styles that you're writing, which can get confusing. To make them all the same across browsers, as in different browsers like Chrome or Internet Explorer or Edge or Firefox, you can use normalize.css, which is a separate CSS file which you can include in your HTML, which makes all the elements look the same.